The following presentation is part of the Beyond the Blast Doors network.
This is Pete Fletzer. On this episode of Around the Galaxy, we're joined by New York Times best-selling biographer Brian J. Jones. Join us as we talk about writing the biography of the maker himself, George Lucas, and the other pop culture lives he's chronicled. So strap yourselves in, relax, and enjoy this journey around the galaxy.
Player, board game player.
We're having a roast.
Why we're here?
And I've got
Good.
like 100,000.
Steele, how are you?
It's
Nice to be saying, and we are actually seeing each other.
Very well. An hour and a quarter.
And this is like the first time we've ever talked, which is quite...
Well, welcome to episode number 65 of Around the Galaxy, the Star Wars fan talk show. I am your host, Pete Fletzer, and we are a part of the Beyond the Blast Doors network. If this is your first visit with Around the Galaxy, well, thank you so much for joining us, and hope you enjoy the ride. And if this is a return visit, welcome back, and thanks for being a part of our crew on a regular basis. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at ATGcast, and if you don't mind, please subscribe, share, rate, and review us, and leave some comments. And whether you're listening on your favorite podcast outlet like iTunes or Spotify, or watching us here on youtube.com/BeyondTheBlastDoors, just leave us a little positivity. It certainly helps. Thank you so much. And one last piece of business before we get things going. If you are enjoying the show and you want to support us and the other shows on the Beyond the Blast Doors network, like BTBD Live or Streaming Star Wars or Postcards from the Galaxy's Edge or Holo Chronicles or Bombadcast, you can go ahead and head on over to patreon.com/Beyond the Blast Doors. The tiers start at just $5 a month. And I'm not great at math, but I know that that's less than $1 per show, since we have 6 shows, 1 day a week other than Sunday. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the math. Point being, $5 a month and you can support some great shows. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I have some great guests. And this week, I'm really excited to bring you an interview with an award-winning biographer, a gentleman named Brian J. Jones. And if you're listening to this podcast or watching this episode on YouTube, you probably know him from his 2016 book, George Lucas, A Life. And it's you probably also may know him from his biography of Jim Henson, and recently his biography of Dr. Suess. So I'm really excited to bring in Brian J. Jones. Brian, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm really pretty good. I'm not too bad.
Not bad considering the world's on fire, huh?
No kidding. It feels like, you got murder hornets, and you've got.
Oh God, I'm more scared of murder hornets, I think, than I am coronavirus. Oh God.
Oh my
God, those are just frightening.
Oh my gosh, and they look like something out of a horror movie. It's just this really is the end of the world. But
less than 2 legs, more than 4, and I punch out. I'm not going to cope well.
That's great. So Brian, like I said in the opener, a lot of people probably know you as the biographer of George Lucas, but maybe tell us a little bit about a little bit of your backstory and how you ended up getting into Star Wars. Let's start with that. What's your sort of Star Wars story?
Well, Star Wars, I'm sort of, when I talk about Jim Henson, I'm Jim Henson Generation 1 in a way, because I'm Sesame Street Generation 1. I was 2 when Sesame Street came out, so I was sort of the first audience it was aimed at. And I was 9 when Star Wars came out. So I was I was Lucas's target audience. He said he was making the movie for the kids, and I was the age that he was making the kids for. So I grew up an original trilogy kid. And that was my Star Wars, and that was how I got into it. And I was also the kind of kid who read, every interview with him. Even when I'm 10, 11 years old, I read interviews in Dynamite magazine. Remember Dynamite?
Yeah.
And read the novel adaptations, and I read the Marvel Comics versions of it. And so I was a Star Wars kid. My brother and I, my brother's 3 years younger, we had every Kenner action figure and playset and vehicle for the first movie. Almost all of them for the second. We never got the Slave One, which we were very disappointed about. And then by the time Jedi came out, we weren't collecting anymore. But yeah, so I'm sort of Star Wars Generation 1.
Oh, that's awesome. And so you again, like I said before, one of your more, you've done biographies for Jim Henson, you've done biographies for George Lucas and Dr. Suess, and I'm only saying Dr. Seuss because I know I'm going to screw up. But if I say Theodore, is it Geisel? Geisel. I'm never sure I'm going to say it right. But so what attracted you to doing biographies about people who aren't just famous creators, but creators that have had a tremendous impact on pop culture and in many ways youth culture?
Well, in a way, I sort of lucked into finding my shelf. My first biography, which came out in 2008, was the American writer Washington Irving, who, when I was pitching that book back in 2005 and 6, I was pitching him as the Sinatra of the 19th century, only because I couldn't think of anybody else like him, because he, like all these other figures, sort of defined the pop culture of the era. I mean, this is a time when America's a new country, and we're between the American Revolution and the Civil War, and we're still finding our way. And he's creating our literature, and he's he's Stephen King, he's John Grisham. When he's renovating his house, if he needs money, he writes a book because he knows it'll sell gangbusters. And he invented viral marketing. I mean, he had a marketing campaign for a book of his in 1809 with like fake newspaper ads that got the entire city buzzing about this book. Really brilliant, interesting, fun guy. It sort of was the pop culture of his era. So that's sort of thematically the guys that I've ended up doing, and they just happen to all be guys. I'm still trying to figure out the woman subject that I want to do, but it tends to sort of be, weirdly my wheelhouse in a way. Sort of these big iconic figures that but there's always a little bit more behind the story. And it's guys that the work defines the man and the man defines the work. And I think that's what makes them so interesting and so fun to research and write about.
Do you find that there is any specific or any sort of threads between a Lucas, a Henson, an Irving, a Geisel?
Well, the through line, even starting with somebody like Washington Irving, is run the table, control it all. Irving was one of these guys that sock puppeted his reviews even back then. Was like really trying to control the way things were marketed in 1832. And that's something that Henson and George Lucas and Ted Geisel all did. They were very picky about merchandising and marketing their material. Very, very serious about this. And both Jim and George were the kind that wanted to hold everything and see it themselves and play with it and see if it fit. And George always talked about, or the guys at Kenner always talked about Star Wars being so toyetic. So one of the through lines in there, I think, is know that your work has value and value your work, because that's the way you're gonna run the table. Neither Henson nor Lucas, until very late in their lives, they both had that similar trajectory in the sense that they both ended up selling their companies, or at least in Jim's lifetime was trying to sell their companies to Walt Disney. But it was like, control everything. Never sell anything you own, never sell anything you love. Right. And when you value that kind of work, it tends to work out for you.
It's probably indicative of their creative style as well, right? I mean, some of the, I've been in marketing, I've been on the creative side of things, I've been in the writing side of things, and it's funny. There is sort of I remember there was a gentleman I worked for 20 plus years ago, and we were doing some like desktop publishing stuff, and he always said, if the customer likes it, I love it. If the customer doesn't like it, I hate it. And that always struck me as being very sort of not a very creative way to do things. But you find that people who can, a great director, for example, may not be a great creative, but he can bring something creative to it. But it sounds like Henson and Lucas and Irving and even Geisel to a degree. They there was so much passion, they weren't going to do it for somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, you'll notice, or maybe you don't, like there wasn't actually a lot of Dr. Seuss merchandising during Dr. Seuss's lifetime. It wasn't until he died and his wife took over the conglomerate and the corporation, and she did it to keep the name out there. It was the right call. But she started marketing stuff. He didn't really do it in his lifetime because, again, he was kind of, again, like Jim and like George Lucas, he didn't want a lot of crap out there.
Right.
He didn't want to saturate his brand. He was actually very smart about it.
Wow. So was one of the things that drew you to doing George Lucas's biography the fact that you were a Star Wars fan?
Yeah, and also a big part of it too was, I mean, when you write biography, when you write nonfiction, you do tend to view your subject and everybody you're writing about as characters. Mm-hmm. And there was a moment when I was writing Jim Henson's biography when he's doing Labyrinth, and here comes George Lucas. And so there were a couple pages there where I got to write George Lucas, and I got to weave him in the narrative, and hear people talk about him. And for a split second I kind of stopped, and I've got a picture of him hanging on the wall in my closet library of Jim and George Lucas together. It's one of the few times that a biographer gets a photo of two of their subjects together.
Yeah.
Making Labyrinth, and it was just one of those moments where I thought, God, that would be really fun one to do next. But then I moved back on and finished the Jim Henson book. So when I did finish the Jim Henson book, I made a run at George Lucas, partly because I'd been told by my editor that Lucas or somebody close to him had sent a note into my editors who they had read the Jim Henson biography and said, hey, Jim was a friend of mine, a professional collaborator, and I really loved him. And the book was fantastic. And I thought, oh God, this is great. He's dying to be done.
Right.
After making a pretty hard run at him, it turned out not so much. But he did tell me no, which everybody around me tells me, wow, he told you no. Usually he never says anything. So the fact I got a no was pretty big. And for about 3 minutes, that really bummed me out. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to do this without him, because the Henson book, I'd had the cooperation of the Henson family. I had free access to their archives and things like that. But if I didn't have Lucas, I wasn't going to have access to Lucasfilm and be able to write those fantastic, making of Star Wars books that Rinsler does and things like that. But without him, I still had access to those great making of Star Wars books that Rinsler does. So there's actually a lot out there, and Lucas, for all his, how much he values his privacy and things, the cat's been talking on the record since about 1964. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And in fact, it was one of those projects that I almost despaired of being able to finish and sort through, because there is just forget Star Wars. Even Star Wars is its own, its own universe, its own closet, its own industry. Indiana Jones is its own industry. Forget even putting those two aside, just the constant amount of stuff that's been written on Lucas and on Pixar and ILM and documentaries and commentaries. There's just so much out there. I just really despaired of ever being able to wrap my arms around it and distill all of that material.
Do you find that I'm really I'm very curious and interested in the process for writing a biography, because as you said, you have to approach it like you're writing about a character, which these people really are. And I always imagine that writing a biography, one of the biggest challenges is like you just pointed out, having having too much information that how are you going to bring something new to it, or B, how are you going to create it in a way that's interesting and not just sort of, and then next year he did this, and then the next day he did that. So how do you approach it, especially in a case like Lucas, like you said, there was so much information available to you. How do you bring it all together to make it a story and not just a catalog?
Yeah, I mean, what I found, my background before I became a biographer is I've worked in politics my entire career, and for about 15 years before the Irving book came out, and 10 of those years I had worked in the United States Senate for 2 different senators. And as I found out later, that staffing a politician, an elected official, is really good practice for biography and nonfiction, because your job is to advise your boss by going through lots and lots and lots and lots of material and distilling it down, and then telling them a story, and giving them your spin in a way. What did you find interesting about it? What were you skeptical about? What would you like? And then ultimately at the end of the memo, you make a recommendation based on that. That's biography. Now, the thing about biography is, as opposed to that, is they always say biography is never completed or finished. It's abandoned, because you never really know that you found everything. But doing that job was actually, I found out later, really good practice, because you do that constantly. You're getting information from all sorts of sources, written. You're talking with people, you're calling people on the phone and getting their take on it, and then you're telling a story. I mean, that's biography.
Right.
And part of it is, as a biographer, is you bring your own biases. And by biases, I mean, you get to decide as a biographer, what do you find interesting? Right. You hope that your readers will find it interesting as well. And, what do you leave out that you didn't think was that interesting or relevant? There's, stuff that I may have left out of George Lucas's story that people who know George Lucas or haven't read about him, like, how could you possibly leave that out? But I get to make that decision. So, it's going through and figuring out things that I think advance the story, advance who I think he was. And the issue, again, the problem you have with biography is as you're writing and researching it, you're learning about your subject. And so a lot of times, something you found really interesting and discovered when you're writing page, 500, you go, oh my God, I have to go back and fix page 3 now
Right.
on this. So it can be a juggling act, keeping track of all that. It really makes you appreciate somebody like Lucas, who was juggling, infinite number of projects at a single given time. How do you keep all those narratives straight? How do you keep all those stories straight?
Yeah.
How do you decide what's true? How do you decide what's their spin? Somebody like George Lucas, for example, has a definite spin on his own story. He's a teller of his own story. He's a teller of his own tales. He's the hero of his own story, as we all try to be.
Sure.
So, for example, he loves to tell all of us that he had the complete 9-act arc of Star Wars planned out from day one. As we all kind of know, absolute baloney. But it's a fantastic story, and it lets him continue to be the creator and the myth maker, and the founder of the mythology in the universe. But not really true. Even something sanctioned like some of Rinsler's Star Wars books really hit him pretty firmly between the eyes on that in spots, which kind of surprised me, because for a long time inside Lucasfilm, they were kind of letting him get away with that. Not quite so much anymore.
Yeah, it's it is interesting because it's and that's kind of being the hero of your own story, right? It's like, no, I did. I knew what I was doing. I knew where I was
I was in charge of that all along. I had it all planned out all along. Yeah.
Is it a challenge to not? And it's sort of a two ways to ask the same question. Is it a challenge to not get caught up in writing a story of Indiana Jones story, the story of the making of Indiana Jones or the making of Willow or whatever, or and do you find, how do you also make sure that Rinsler does a great job with those kinds of books, for example? How do you find that you're like consciously trying to stay away from the movie parts? Or
Great question, and the answer to that is no, because anybody who picks up a book on George Lucas, if you don't talk about Star Wars, it never makes it into their shopping cart.
Right.
So Star Wars is your money shot, and everybody, my editor knows it, and Little Brown, my publisher, knew it. I knew it. I mean, you can't let people down on Star Wars. I tend to tell stories chronologically. A lot of people get very creative with biography, and they'll jump around timeline wise. I'm not quite smart enough to do it that way. But the other thing about the subjects that I've done is their stories are very causal, in the sense that a lesson they learned here affected the way they went to the next project. And then a lesson on that project or a failure affected the way they went to the next one. And so for people like Jim Henson, George Lucas, Dr. Suess, people who are incredibly creative and projects grow out of lessons you've learned, you kind of do have to tell it in order. So what that means for George Lucas is, even though he was only 32 when when Star Wars comes out, he's actually done a whole lot of stuff before that. You can't go rushing through American Graffiti. You can't go rushing through THX 1138 and the lessons he learned from that. You can't go rushing through the era of American Zoetrope with Coppola and how formative that was to him, and how pissed off he was at the studio, and how that actually shaped him as a filmmaker and the way he viewed Hollywood and the Hollywood structure. Right. So you have to you have to cover all of that ground. You can't get into the weeds too much with it, even as you might want to, because you do have to keep things moving. And again, you do know people, they want to get to Star Wars and they're ready when they get there. And when you get to Star Wars, you got to sprawl. I mean, that's when you got to lay that out, and you can't let people down. I was never more aware of that than when I wrote the chapter in the Jim Henson book on the Muppet Show. It's a gigantic chapter, and I was trying to do a lot of different things in that chapter and talk about a typical work week and the creation of characters and how they brought in, doing an awful lot of heavy lifting. But it's such an important part to the story that I appreciate you as readers sitting with me through the 1960s, which I think is such an interesting period for Jim, and watching him do his hippie documentaries. But I know you're trying to get to Sesame Street and the Muppet Show. Right. And with Lucas, people want to get to Star Wars. I sort of patted myself on the back with how cleverly I broke that narrative up into 3 sections, calling it Hope and Empire and Return. It's like Star Wars shows up, I think, at the opening of right at the end of Hope and right at the beginning of Empire is when he's finally doing that. So you have to make it through some of these other things. And I see people talking about, I couldn't get through the chapter with all the family tree listing. Well, that's only about 5 or 6 pages, which means you didn't try that hard. But as a reader of biography, I get it. Yeah. I don't want to sit and go through family trees and keep having to turn back to the front of the book and look at the family tree on the front and who's related to who, especially with somebody like George Lucas, where he's George and his father's George, and Dr. Seuss, where he's Theodore and his father's Theodore and his grandfather's Theodore, and it's like it's impossible he's a player, so you just want to get through it.
Right.
But you've got to lay the track.
Yeah.
So with Lucas, you have to decide early, as we've been saying, what's important. What do I, as the biographer, think is important and interesting about him? And for Lucas, it's control. So you try to lay that down in those early chapters when you say, I'm going to take you through his childhood. Bear with me. I'm going to try to make it as interesting as I can, putting in what I think is interesting, and that's going to be our big theme. And we'll get there. So so trust me. So it's a tight wire act that you walk as the biographer with your reader sort of by the hand.
I think you probably benefit from the fact that you weren't doing it with him, and this is just my own weird, crazy personal opinion, but because I've read autobiographies of some of my favorite musicians and you can tell they're like, no, I'm going to talk about living in England in the 1930s, and you're like,
right.
That's great, but that's not why I care about you as a musician or whatever it might be.
And again, with Lucas, he's an unreliable narrator.
Right.
You can't, as we all are. You can't trust everything he says. It's trust but verify, as Reagan said. You let him say it, and I tend to try to do that in my biographies. I tend to let my subjects say their piece, and then I'm going to come along and maybe sweep up a little bit behind them. And you have to do that with Lucas quite a bit.
Yeah, that's it. What was some of your favorite Lucas stories? What were the things that you were like, this is going to be the 10? I mean, obviously Star Wars, right? But I mean, in reading your book, that you have a lot of really interesting pieces of it that you may have heard in one way or another, or never heard before. But what were some of the things that maybe even tying it to your fandom as being a Star Wars fan as a kid? What were the things that made you like, wow, I didn't know this, or this is an interesting thing that I need to pursue?
Well, I love that Zoetrope era. Because again, it is so sort of formative with him, and it's interesting to me that he's always from very early on from the time he's in USC, and that's one of the things that's so interesting is how USC is really important to him, and that's where he makes a lot of the friendships and relationships that stay with him the rest of his life. And his wife Marsha often joked that he made his group of 12 or 15 friends in college and never felt the need to make any more beyond that. But what a group of friends they are. It's like John Milius and. All of a sudden, I can't name them all, but and then being mentored by Francis Ford Coppola, who takes Lucas under his wing and says, if you don't learn how to write, no one's going to take you seriously as a director. Right. And what I love about that is, of the two of them, Lucas is the one that took that advice to heart, has created two iconic franchises, and meanwhile, Coppola has made his name adapting other people's works.
Right.
That is funny. I love that sort of formative era. I love looking at the parts of their lives that make them who they are. And again, what's so interesting about Zoetrope is, as I was saying earlier, that's when Lucas gets pissed off. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes him George Lucas. That's when he figures out early on, and and part of it is the cynicism and idealism of being 20 years old. I was there once myself. But how the suits ruin everything, and they're going to step on the creatives and the artists, and they don't respect the artist. The best thing you can do is take and he talks in communist terms about the workers taking control of the means of production and things like that. He's very idealistic, very, very angry.
Right.
And that's what makes him who he is. And I love that part of his story. I love that part of his life.
That's great. Yeah, it's and it is interesting because you do see that that sort of philosophy even plays so much in the stories that he developed. If you don't mind, I want to ask you a question I got from one of my patrons. I told him that I was speaking to you, and I'm just going to read it to you because it's pretty. I love the way he sets it up. He says he finished reading Brian J. Jones's Henson biography on an airplane and thought it was beautiful, and he cried so hard at the closing chapters that the flight attendant came and checked to make sure he was all right.
Sorry about that.
But he says, looking at your three subjects, particularly Henson and Lucas, what do you think these creators understand about children and adolescents that help their creation speak so strongly to many of us, and what values he thinks those kids took into our adulthood?
Well, I think it's a commonality that runs between Henson and Lucas and Dr. Seuss, and it's that ability to treat children and young viewers and young readers with absolute respect and reverence in a way. You never talk down to your audience, and all three of those guys never did that. They always knew that kids, Dr. Seuss, in fact, is one who advised a bunch of aspiring, writers for youth and writers for children. Don't resort to these fancy, gymnastics in your prose or your poetry, because kids are smarter than you. They will see you coming from a mile away. And Jim Henson, people always said, he had this ability to see a kid's right at their level, see them eye to eye, meet them eye to eye. And people said the same thing about Dr. Seuss. And I think Lucas is that way too. Lucas has a genuine love for his source material. It's not camp to him. Those are things he loved. As a child, as a teenager, as a 10-year-old, so on, he takes them seriously. There's a reverence to that work. There's a reverence to that material. And so when he's putting that on screen, he's not patronizing to kids. He's saying, you know what? I think this is fun. I think this is entertaining, and I think you will too. And he's right, because it's absolutely straight. He is absolutely straight about it.
Yeah,
there's no camp factor involved in it at all.
Right, or he doesn't even. It's funny because you look at somebody like Jar Jar Binks, who gets a lot of for being such a childish character, but it's in a way once I as a fan accepted that that's what he was there for. He was a Muppet type of character, right? He was and
he's goofy. Lucas says he's goofy.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's funny to watch, like I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, and my daughter, who's 10, she loves Jar Jar Binks, and she, and it works. I mean, that's what he was trying to do, and that's what's pretty amazing about it. So were there? Yeah,
it's like you can say about Lucas with Jar Jar Binks the same. It's what I always used to say about Jim Henson with things like The Dark Crystal. Is they were right, but at the wrong time. Every years later, people go, oh. Okay, I get it. And I think that kind of happened with Lucas and Jar Jar. I'm still not a Jar Jar fan, but Jar Jar wasn't made for me. He was made for my daughter, who's 23 now. That was her Star Wars. Right,
exactly. And that's again, I love what you said about Dark Crystal, because these were things that without Jar Jar Binks, right, for better or worse, you don't get the characters that you have now that are entirely computer generated, right? You couldn't build a bad guy at that point with the new technology. You had to build something that was a bit.
And it's a perfect way of saying that. I mean, it's like Lucas loves the technology, and that's one of his biggest accomplishments and biggest contributions to film. I mean, he even always says that that's one of the things he wants on his tombstone is the digital filmmaking, and then maybe those esoteric science fiction movies, as he said. And Jim Henson was like that. Dark Crystal is him playing with the technology,
right?
And the prequel trilogy is kind of Lucas playing with that technology first, and then worrying more about the story second. So so the story falls to the wayside over the tech. Lucas loved that tech.
Yeah, I mean, I always find it incredibly ironic, because I remember, much like we were talking about at the start about reading everything we could find about Star Wars or George. I remember reading an article in Starlog, I think it was Starlog magazine, which I'm sure you probably remember as well, where they were shooting Return of the Jedi, and he was saying, you can't let your scenery take over your story. You have to and then 20 years, 15 years later, the scenery took over. But and
it's so typical of both Lucas and Henson. But that's again, let's take something like Dark Crystal, and then take something like Episode 1. Both of them, with those particular movies, were so interested in the world building.
Yeah,
like you could have asked Lucas the backstory of any character in Episode 1, and he could have given it to you. And it doesn't matter if it didn't matter. And Jim was that way with Dark Crystal. He loved that world building. And it's like, and people always say, I remember when I saw Star Wars in the theater, and when I watched it, in my late teens and 20s, and there's that almost throwaway line where they say, oh, we've returned power to the local governors and dissolved the Senate. And for a split second you go, oh, well, that's really interesting. I'd love to know the politics behind that.
Right.
Well, as it turned out, not so much. But that's Lucas putting that over. Like, he was interested in that.
Yeah.
And he's got the backstory of everything. And the politics are important to Star Wars. But even as somebody who did politics my entire life, I get lost in Attack of the Clones trying to keep track of all of it.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think, as a storyteller, you probably appreciate this as well. And one of the things that I loved about A New Hope, and I think this is one of the things that made Star Wars so great, was exactly that attention to detail, that knowledge that he was bringing in, and was willing to drop a line. I said this on the show recently with a guest about how when you watch A New Hope and Obi-Wan is talking to Luke, and Luke says, "My father didn't fight in the Clone Wars," and they cut the Clone Wars. Holy cow! And I remember speaking when I was 7. I remember me and my dad just like, "What do you think the Clone Wars were?" And all these other things. Whereas today, if you tell a story, there would have been a 10-minute flashback to the Clone Wars, and you can't walk out of the theater without knowing those details. But instead, because George knew it, however detailed he may or may not have known it, he knew enough about it to bring it to that to put it in the story and let you figure it out.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's a lesson he learned from Kurosawa. Kurosawa took his viewer and he drops you into 14th century Japan, and he's like, you know what, you'll figure it out. and Lucas is kind of the way with Star Wars. He drops us into the middle of a battle.
Yeah.
Like when we first tune in to start watching Star Wars, we don't know who the good guys and the bad guys are right away. They help us out, and even the bad guys have white on at first. It's not until Vader walks in, it's very obvious. But he sort of drops us in right in the middle of the action, and he's like, you know what, you'll get it. Just stay with it. But the other thing that I think is really important to remember about Star Wars, and one of the things that I think is great about it, and why the original Star Wars is still such a fantastic movie and can stand by itself, is because Lucas didn't know he was going to get to do anymore. He thought this was his one shot, so he was putting everything into that movie that he loved about science fiction and storytelling and comic books and old Saturday morning serials, and trying to just get it done because he thought he was never going to have a chance to make another one. So I think that's why everything in that movie is interesting, including, like you said, those throwaway lines like the Clone War and dissolving the Senate and returning power to the local governors, and just junk lines that's giving you backstory that he probably didn't even really have developed. But he was like, this is the way that you talk in a serial. You talk about weird, science that people have that they'll just get it. Lucas is doing that in Star Wars, and it makes it fantastic. And I think that's part of what makes it so timeless, is it does just drop you in right in the middle of the action.
This may not be a fair question to ask, but I'm going to give it a try anyway. Based on from what you've known from doing the research on him, why do you think his return to his stories tends to be less popular? And what I mean by that is, for example, prequels. Now, the Star Wars fans, the hardcore Star Wars fans that I talk to on a regular basis, we've come to love the prequels. In fact, there's a phrase Ken Napzok, another writer, uses. He calls himself a reformed prequelist, right? But when the prequels first came out, there was that backlash. The fourth Indiana Jones movie, going back and visiting that story again, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to tell you it's their favorite Indiana Jones movie. So what do you, based on what you know from doing the research on him, why do you think the returns are a bigger challenge? And I know it's not exclusive to him, but maybe in the way he approaches the stories at that point.
Well, I think partly is the stakes are higher. And I think that can make you try too hard at times, and there can be an element of fan service, even though Lucas, I think, will always claim that he's never doing fan service.
Right.
I think there's an element of that if you try too hard not to do it, you end up doing it.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's hard to keep going back to that well. And again, what's so interesting again about Lucas is he's this guy who's like, all I want to do is my esoteric tone poems and these quiet documentaries and films like Mishima and things like that. And he just keeps going back to Star Wars and Indiana Jones.
Right.
And then he tries something weird like Strange Magic, and everyone throws up their hands. And what's how that was. So I don't know. I mean, there's part of it is you always run the risk when you're dealing with the nostalgia factor anyway. It has a built-in audience, and it has built-in skepticism right from day one.
Right.
And I think partly Lucas has the problem in that when he announced he was going back to make the prequels, and you had the stories of people standing in line for hours to get tickets to, what was it, Billy Madison or something, or the Water Boy, so they could just watch the trailer.
The trailer,
walk
yeah.
Out.
Yep.
And then the hype going into it and all the marketing, and then people ended up hating the movie. And I think that they felt that they forget the George Lucas crap in my childhood. I think they were like, well, we're not going to get stung by that again.
Right.
So Lucas can be his own worst enemy at the time on that, just because expectations are so high, because he is George Lucas, and Star Wars is a really tough act to follow. I don't know what he could have done mean, I know he could have done a lot of stuff, but I mean, he was telling the story he wanted to tell, doing it the way he wanted to tell it, which he actually had never been able to do before.
Right.
And it does make you wonder, had he had the unlimited resources and digital technology at his disposal for episode 4, would it have ended up being the classic that we all know and love? I don't know. So I just think part of it is, success is its own worst enemy at times.
It's funny you put it that way, because one of the observations I've had is that I look at the 3 trilogies, and obviously Lucas had nothing to do with the sequel trilogy other than getting a lot of money from Disney to allow them to do it.
Right.
But you look at the original trilogy, and as you pointed out earlier, that movie was made. Sure, that came from his head and it was his story, but man, he was being supported by some of his best friends who became some of the best movie makers in history. But it was him forced to find a way to do it. When he did the prequels, he was in a mindset of nobody's going to tell me what to do. I'm going to do it my way. And then the sequels are truly made. And as much as I enjoy them, I do see where they're made by in the Avengers era versus that new. So I mean, I think it can't be overstated the role that was played by all his California friends at that time.
Yeah, no, and especially, I mean, again, getting back to the original Star Wars, which is still my favorite. I mean, that's his group of hippies, and I can't remember what I called that chapter. It was hippies and something. That's his hippie friends who are all still scrappy and scrapping and trying to get their films done. And it's a who's who when you look at the names of the people involved in that. And he's showing the movie to his friends, and Steven Spielberg is the only one in the group who pulls him aside and says, I think you've got a hit on your hand. Whereas everybody else is just like, what in the heck is this? And and I don't understand what this force of others is. And you've got a problem with that opening crawl. And my God, especially, I mean, you've got your friends who you have there to support you, just telling you that they think you've got a colossal dud on your hand. But it's that era. It's all these young up and comers, which we forget, and that makes it very exciting. I mean, I love that Marcia Lucas, his wife, how was she paying the bills? She was editing for their friend Martin Scorsese.
Right.
They were all helping each other. You're like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
So I think a big part of it is that's still in that young and hungry phase of his career, which is when you tend to take those chances and say F the system. And and again, Lucas is mad because he can't get enough money and he can't film the cantina scene the way he wants. As you were saying, what would happen with limitless resources on that now?
Right. Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. The sequel trilogy do feel like the Age of Avengers. Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
So based on, you've spoken to some of the, I guess we've said it 100 times, some of the greatest creators. Who do you think is that next generation? Who's the filmmaker, writer, author, creator that 20 years from now we're going to say that's the guy that was, or woman who, who's the next George Lucas, Spielberg person?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, Pete. I just don't know. I mean, part of it is you have people who are great filmmakers who make reliably great films constantly. Somebody like Quentin Tarantino, and you still have Scorsese out there doing it.
Right.
But do you have people who are like the myth makers who are creating their own? I mean, you had it for a split second with maybe The Matrix.
Right.
And the Wachowskis.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anybody doing that right now? I just don't know. And again, for a while, you might have had it with the Game of Thrones showrunners, even though it was their original work. But they got handed the Star Wars franchise for about 2 days.
Right. Yep.
So I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. When I was writing about Dr. Seuss, I was like, well, the heir apparent on that is somebody like J.K. Rowling, who's like creating books that kids want to. Sometimes they seem a little more obvious. I can't really come up with it for Lucas. I just don't know.
Yeah, it wasn't a fair question, but I thought I'd throw it there.
I mean, who do you think? I try to go down the list of like what are the big movies now, but even something like the Marvel movies, there's not a standard director affiliated with all of them. They're kind of spread out. You have great directors doing great work, but
I agree. I think it's going to fall more into that producer developer kind of person. I think Favreau is doing really interesting things right now. But again, I don't know. Is it that I think the difference now is they are being driven by, I think there's somebody who's going to have to break out of that system and who's going to create something that's individual again. And look, I enjoy the Marvel movies. They're fun to, chomp down a whole bunch of popcorn and spend 2 hours. But I'll be honest, I've never gone to see a Marvel movie twice in the theater.
Right.
They're fun. My kids love them, but they're not sticking with me. Somebody was saying that the Marvel movies are the Star Wars of this generation. I don't think they are. I don't see my son coming back to it in 20 years with the same sort of love. And it, I guess every 10 years or so we end up in this bolus of just shiny stuff, and the 80s had a lot of that, and then
and people talk about the Lord of the Rings. I'm like, well, no, that's Lord of the Rings,
right.
we had that before, that goes way back. So that's not quite fair. Like the movies, they are awesome, and and those of us who are Lord of the Rings nerds were like so happy someone finally got it right, but that
right.
It's already kind of its own thing. And that's why, I mean, you want to almost like lean in to Favreau, and even somebody like J.J. Abrams, who beyond Star Wars does really interesting stuff too, but like I mean, here's Abrams playing in the Star Trek universe, so
right.
It's like you keep waiting for somebody to do the new material that kind of creates a new mythology. I don't know that we've got that right now.
And and boy, I could geek out on this for days, but you see something like even Ridley Scott had that opportunity with the Alien series, and that kind of fell off, and so it's hard. And I think maybe that's exactly what it is. You don't know who it's going to be, and maybe that's what makes the magic of a Jim Henson.
Yeah, that makes you're making me think of talking about Ridley Scott. One of them that you could have had, but it became a cartoon, and then they tried again to make it serious, and nobody went to see it. Is the Terminator.
Right.
So the Terminator and its franchise had its own universe. It had its own logic, and for the first, even 3 Terminators, it's got like a forward-moving trajectory and a story, and it's got a consistency to it, and then it starts to kind of fall apart. Right. And then they tried to come back to it, 1 or 2 years ago, and people just didn't buy it anymore at that point.
Right.
But there again was a universe with its own characters. That's what we're not seeing right now with somebody that's creating their own universe.
Right.
That's consistent from film to film and with new characters.
And maybe it is because we're in the age of Avengers now, where it's a risk, right? Dark Crystal would never be made today.
Absolutely
There's
not.
No way that would get done. Star Wars probably wouldn't have gotten made, just because it's if you have a whole bunch of people who like you said, people who are your friends telling you this is garbage, it's gonna be hard to get out through the studio.
Right. I mean, thank God he already had his studio deal. I wouldn't have gone out to try to get one after hearing what everybody had to say.
That's funny. Well, Brian, I'm going to walk you through the 10 question segment of the show here. This is sort of like inside the actor's studio. There's no wrong answers, but I might judge you a little bit based on what
okay.
But no, there's no pressure at all. They're very simple, and you can give short answers. You can extend them as long as you like, whatever you want. But the first question is, what is your favorite Star Wars movie, TV show, or book?
So Empire is the glam rock one that everybody loves and everyone returns to, but I am still a Star Wars guy. And you'll notice in the book, I never call it Episode 4. I never call it A New Hope. That was my own bias showing. It is Star Wars to me, and I still love it. And I'm part of the problem in that I have bought that movie every time it's been re-released and remixed and remastered, and I also still have like the pirate versions that have all the original effects in them that people have traded around. So I love Star Wars.
Do you remember the first time you saw it?
God, people ask me this all the time, and I don't. I don't have that sensation of remembering walking to the theater. But here's what I do have, and I have never forgotten seeing the trailer the first time.
Really?
Because seeing that trailer made me want to see that film, and then I wish I could make the leap then to tell you that I remember seeing the film, and I don't. But I remember that trailer. I remember sitting in a dark theater, and I'm sure we were seeing something like the Apple Dumpling Gang or something like that. And I've never forgotten that trailer and how it's got. I think it's isn't it Orson Welles who's doing the voiceover for somebody? Yep. And it's this very serious trailer, and it's cut together very weird. Which after researching Lucas, I understand like they were still putting it together, so they didn't have all their footage. but it's it's like it's hard to tell what's going on. You don't actually know what the plot is, and it's got a very heavy-handed narration to it.
Right.
but I'll never forget the image of R2D2 falling over. That was the part that really stuck with me. And my younger brother and I kept talking about the fake guy. See that fake guy in there, that thing that fell over? But we had to go see that because it didn't look like anything else. I think you and I are close to the same age. Like science fiction movies in the 70s, everything was shiny and glossy and white and pristine and new.
Yeah.
And the thing about Star Wars is it did not look like that. And that was one of the things I remember that I was like, I have got to see this. What is going on? So I have never forgotten that trailer.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that, again, that's why it's hard to say who's going to be the next big thing, because who would have thought that that's what's going to make my story stand out is everything's not going to be Buck Rogers and shiny red boots and stuff. It's going to be dirty and as it's been said, lived in. And that's an amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it could only come from the mind of a guy who was like, drag raced for a living, I mean, it's like Lucas defines that, the look of that film, whether he likes it or not. And the studio trying to bury it, taking it out in May, just trying to get it in and out of theaters as quickly as possible, turned out to be the best thing for it.
Right. Yep, absolutely. Well, then I have to ask the follow-up question, which is, what is your least favorite Star Wars movie, TV show, or book?
I'm going to take the Ewoks Caravan of Courage and I can't remember the other one. I'm going to take those out of it. I'm just going to stick with the films more than anything else. I find Episode 2 to be a real slog. I think it's like I think it's overwritten. It is the one movie where I think it's Lucas playing with the technology to the point where there is so much going on screen. I never know where to look. I never know quite what I'm looking at. I never know quite where the action that I'm supposed to be watching is going on. I have a real problem with this. It might be because I'm old and tired. But even when I was younger and tired and watched it in the theater, I saw that at the Uptown in Washington D.C. in the theater. And again, I came out of my background's in politics, and I'm in there, and I'm like, I just can't get the politics of this.
Yeah, it's funny. It's the this is making sure I earn my geek card. It's I knew we were in for something weird when I was working for Star Wars Galaxy magazine around that time, and I was at the premiere in New York, and when it pans up instead of down,
right?
I know I'm going real deep on you here,
I'm with you.
but I was like, this doesn't something's not right here. But it's right. And you may take comfort in knowing that of the other 64 people I've spoken to on my show, about 40 have said the same thing as you. So you're not alone there. That's just consistent. All right. Would you consider yourself? Hold on a second. Where is it here? Would you consider yourself an Imperial or a Rebel?
No, I'm Resistance all the way. I'm just gonna leave it at that. I'm Resistance. I'm with the Resistance.
Okay. I'm with the Resistance. What is your favorite Star Wars sound effect?
Cool shiny stuff, but there's something about having like the cool beat up stuff that's kind of fun too. So.
Right, you're working for it.
My favorite sound effect. You do always kind of like the classic pew pew sound. But the sound I always come back to that I say even if I like burn something in the kitchen is Utini.
That's right. I actually I had the opportunity on one of my episodes a while ago. There was a woman who was one of the Jawas when she was like 7 years old in school, and they pulled some kids out. Just a really cool story. But I mean, there's so many just yellable sound effects, which is great.
And I've got the book they put out there. You can like push all the buttons and play all the sound effects. And even when I was a kid, I had the Imperial troop transporter that had the 6 buttons on top where you could play the R2D2 beep. Like I love that thing. I mean, the sound effects in Star Wars are just fantastic.
Every now and then I'll see that on eBay or something, and I'll be like, I kind of want it, but I don't. I fight the urge.
My brother's got it, but we still have ours.
That's awesome. All right, who's your favorite droid, R2, 3PO, or BB-8?
Ooh, tough call. I love BB-8. I'm still old school on that, and it took me a long time to warm to R2 just because he seemed so devoid of personality when I was 10. And I've really grown to love that droid. But I think I'm still going to go with the fussy Butler C-3PO just because there's something about him that makes you pull for him half the time. He's always, he's always doing his best. He's always very earnest, and people are shutting him down. And I'm still not sure how I feel about them wiping his memory in the last one. So yeah, I'm 3PO. I'm Team 3PO on that.
Team 3PO. Awesome. Did you read Anthony Daniels' biography?
I have not. I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
It's really good. I enjoyed it, and it's funny, as I was saying before. The dangers of an autobiography. He does the person he worked with. I wish I could remember who it was. The book is up there somewhere. So good at getting to the stuff you want to hear, and
that's good.
It's
Yeah.
a really, really good book. I give it a.
And I can't believe he can still get into the suit. I mean, good for him. After all these years, he's still able to climb back into that outfit, and doesn't. Yeah. I don't care that they've made it out of lighter materials and all that. The fact that he still fits that costume. That he still. I mean, that's great. Good on him. Fantastic.
Yeah,
I can't wear the same shirt I wore 2 years ago.
The same sweatpants. That's right. Oh man, that's funny. All right. So, what spaceship or vehicle from the Star Wars universe would you most like to own?
No brainer. From day one, the Millennium Falcon. I mean, just no contest. That was the Kenner ship that my brother and I wanted the most. He got it for Christmas one year. I love that ship. I used to, even when I was 16 and 17, my first car was this beat up white Trans Am, and I used to call it the Falcon all the time. So I love the Millennium Falcon. I don't have the 8,000 piece Lego kit. I wish I did, but I'm such a sucker for the Falcon. I could never draw it. I used to draw my own cartoons, and I just can't draw the Falcon. It's impossible to draw.
It's such, and it's again, it's have you been to Galaxy's Edge at Disney?
Haven't yet, no.
Oh, man, when I didn't I didn't think it would I'm not gonna over dramatize it and say that I fell on my knees and cried, but to see it in person is really wild, just because as you said, it's
and again, everyone I've spoken with who is in our age bracket, they all say the same thing. They're like, I didn't necessarily break down crying, but they're like, but I got weak in the knees seeing it sitting there. There's just something about seeing that ship in 3D in scale that just makes us in particular just lose it.
Yeah, and in a way, the Falcon is like a character, and in the whole series, so it's wild. All right, you have to choose one: Porg, Ewok, or Jar Jar Binks.
Not F. Mary Killer, just pick one. The Porgs. I like the Porgs.
All right, that's good. That's cool. It's as I was saying before. My daughter, I asked her this question. She said, "Daddy, that's not fair. I love them all," and I thought that was kind of interesting. So it's all good. All right. So if you could be any character in Star Wars, who would it be and why?
Well, again, this was just 10-year-old wish fulfillment. I always wanted to be Han, just because he was so cool. There's just something cool about the pirate and the rogue and the cowboy. He was the cowboy of the show.
Yeah.
So that to me is, again, that's the easy one, and I wish I had a cooler answer than that. But even as a kid, when we played with our action figures, I was always Han. Plus, you got to fly the Falcon then too, so I got to drive the Falcon as well.
It's double. Yeah, and it's funny because there's something about his character that I think even as a 10-year-old, you kind of knew that he wasn't perfect, but he was still cool. He was an achievable cool in some way. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I always made my younger brother, be Luke, and I mean, it was everyone's like, well, that was your relationship anyway. I was like, well, no, because I was never that cool, and my brother was never quite that wide-eyed and dorky, but that was just the way it always was going to fall out. He was going to have to play Luke.
I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this one. Your favorite trilogy?
I'm original trilogy.
Yeah.
And what's great about Star Wars, and this is the way I always try to talk about this. I put up a list one day of things about, if you're a George Lucas fan, that you would find disappointing about him, and if you weren't a George Lucas fan, things you would admire about him. And as one of my joke lines, I put, if you're a George Lucas fan, one of the things you won't like is you still have to deal with Episode 1. And somebody got very upset with me about that, and I said, well, that was partially in jest. I was more taking the shot at Radioland Murders, but but it's I try not to get the habit of crapping on anyone's Star Wars, because that's the great thing about Star Wars is, and part of it was luck. It's spaced out in such a way like, timeline wise, that everybody kind of gets their own. So far.
Right.
And that's really cool. And so that's why I say, I'm not going to tell some kid sitting wide-eyed in the theater in episode 1. I love that Jon Stewart's got the great story where he says, my son tells me that the Phantom Menace is his favorite Star Wars movie, and I tell him, no, it's not. It's like, it's not my place to tell a 6-year-old, let me explain to you why Attack of the Clones is actually a terrible movie. You know what? That's theirs, and let them have that. They can have that. I can let them have it. That's their Star Wars, and it's not my place to tell them that's that's not the right Star Wars. I have mine, and there's people who are going to be raised on the sequel trilogies now, as much as we all crap on the Last Jedi or not the Last Jedi, on Rise of Skywalker or whatever it is. Then in 10 years, there's going to be people who absolutely adore and embrace those movies and will defend them to the death in the same way that we'll all, go to the grave defending, Empire Strikes Back.
Yep. It's very true. And I think that's one of the most brilliant things about Star Wars. And in a way, it goes to the question about understanding that youth perspective is that you're going to enter it from your own door, right? And you and I entered it in 1977. My son, who's 7 years old, it was very interesting. He loves the Clone Wars TV show, the animated show. And what's really interesting to me is I took for it's like when I was his baseball coach. I took for granted that everybody knows you go to first base, second base, third base, and then home. But when they're 5 years old, they have no idea. But I took for granted that he knew that the clones were going to turn at some point.
Oh wow, yeah.
And when they did, his little 7-year-old face just dropped. He was shocked. I was like, I've just scarred this boy for life. But the point being, and you're 100% right. And that's the kind of attitude I think that's really important is my daughter loves Rey. So she loves the sequels, and she likes the other movies. She can't get into the prequels at all. She likes the, but it's, everybody's got their doorway and nobody's wrong. And I think that's the important thing to remember is nobody's wrong. It's how did you get there? And it just matters that you made it. So that's interesting. What's your favorite Star Wars quote?
So a lot of times when I'm signing the George Lucas biography, people ask me to write one of my favorite quotes. And one that I write a lot is no disintegrations.
Now, did you, just as you say that, did you watch the Mandalorian series on Disney Plus?
Yes, I loved it.
How great was it to see disintegrations?
Yeah. Oh my God. And I have to tell you, I was, it's like when I heard them announce that, and I went, oh God, come on, I'm not a Boba Fett fetishist, and I was like, I'm going to watch this out of my professional obligation to be able to discuss Star Wars. So I loved it. I mean, it's like a Sergio Leone Western or something. It's just, it was fantastic. I did not see it coming. I thought it was fantastic.
They did such a nice job of capturing, and this is why I like Favreau. Like when I threw his name out there, is he captured the essence in a way of what Star Wars it was. I mean, there's pieces of this that are of Mandalorian that are campy enough to be original Star Wars. There's puppets that aren't perfect, which fits in Star Wars, and it's gritty. It's really the Star Wars I think that you and I growing up playing with our toys would have created.
Yeah, and the other thing about it, what's so surprising is it's so quiet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's like every episode is like most episodes are very deliberate.
Yeah.
Like there's going to be one thing that happens in it basically, and the rest of the episode is them getting to that thing. And so it's very deliberate without being slow.
Right.
And very, very quiet. I don't know, like I said, I'm very impressed. I did not know what to expect from it, and I was delighted with it.
That's awesome. That's great. So Brian, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Where can people find you online, and what's coming up for you?
You can find me online. I'm at my website is Brian J. Jones, all one word, spell out Jay. Otherwise, you'll spend 300 pages looking at Rolling Stone stuff. Brian J. Jones, that's my website, brianjjones.com. I'm also at Twitter at Brian J. Jones. That's where I'm running my mouth most of the time. I have a Facebook page that's also, I think, official Brian J. Jones, and Instagram, but Twitter is where you can find me, causing trouble and running my mouth. So what am I working on right now? I don't know. This is the first time in 15 years, I think, that I haven't known what I'm working on. Dr. Seuss comes out in paperback.
Right, later this month?
20 days, 20 or 19 days now this month. But I don't know who I'm doing next. I had somebody tell me on another podcast, "Oh, you tend to do people I love," and I said, "Well, then tell me somebody else you love so I can do them next." Because I don't know how. The hard part is with biography. First of all, is biographers have to live with their subjects for 3-5 years, sometimes 7, sometimes longer. And I have some colleagues who are able to compartmentalize, and like I couldn't write about Richard Nixon, for example. I couldn't live with Nixon for 5-7 years. So I've been very lucky in that the subjects I choose are people that I'm like, yeah, I could I don't mind going down the stairs and writing about George Lucas and living that life for a while. So you have to kind of find the right fit between biographer and subject. I have a lot of people bring me ideas and I'm like, that's a great subject. I'm not the right person for that. And that's a hard part of biography. You also have to come up with subjects that haven't been, there's sort of a statute of limitations on some of them. But it's the main part. The hard part is finding the right fit. And I tend to do names and the problem with that is most of the names tend to get done.
Right.
So it's finding those that haven't been done, and it's like I'm not smart enough to find Seabiscuit, for example. Find those people you've never heard of and make it turn into something great. I tend to do at least names that
right.
and try to tell stories in a comprehensive way so you can see what's really going on there. So yeah, I don't know who I'm doing next. I had somebody suggest Walt Disney, but I don't think you could do Disney any better than Neil Gabler did him a couple of years back. So.
Yeah, and it's you're right. It's a tough story also to tell in a different way, because I think. Wow, so,
what can you bring to it? Yeah, I don't know what I could bring to the story.
So,
of Disney.
Do you know who you would? Maybe you sort of answered this, but who would you want to do? If there was nobody who ever done it before, it doesn't matter. Just who?
Well, okay. Well, here's one that hasn't really been done, but if it was a perfect world and you didn't have to worry about pitching stuff and people being like, I'm not sure that would sell or anything. Perfect world. I'm a huge Beatles nerd, even though they were broken up right as I was born. I would love to do Ringo Starr. Ringo's never been done. Not really. Yeah, hard to believe, isn't it?
It is.
What I have heard is that he doesn't remember anything after about 1980. So if you sat and interviewed him, you probably wouldn't get a lot of good stuff out of him. But it's just like I would love to do one, Ringo, and call it something like the seat from the seat in the corner or something like that. He always talked about how during Sgt. Pepper he learned how to play chess because it took so long and he was waiting for them to come. So I think it'd be great. I think he's fascinating and fun, and he's sort of the if you're looking at the Beatles and as all parts of a single person, he's the flesh and blood of the Beatles there. I think he'd be really fun to do, and has not been done. So that's one that I've been pitching Ringo for probably 9 years. It's never going to land. But that's one that I always throw out.
I would definitely read Ringo's book.
I would too, but there's two.
There's two. They've got 2 copies sold. That's what more. How many more do they really need? Well, Brian, thank you so much. This has been a blast, and I hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
I would love that. Thanks very much.
Thanks.